I'm just going to thank you for coming back and being with us today. I'm not going to take a lot of time. Thinking about what I was going to say, I was kind of hearkening back to a presentation that I made. Gosh, I think it was like maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and I think it was San Diego. We just got a lot of money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for urban forestry and some other new programs that come online. And it was just a really strong, powerful year for urban forestry. And really, this conversation is going to be nothing like that. So I just wanted to brace you right now, and I'm going to break it down to a few parts and then leave time for questions. Covering a little bit of ground that we already went over this morning. As John said, he hopes to award some grants by the end of this month. One of the questions that has come up is, are those funds secure? Obviously, Department of Finance is really battening down the hatches in terms of restricting travel on state agencies, new contracts and grants related to the procurement of goods. But we were really fortunate in that the funds that John's using to award these contracts, greenhouse gas reduction funds, were protected by trailer bill language last year. So we do feel fairly secure that he's going to be able to go forward with those grants, and that will hopefully provide a lifeline to a few groups that applied and were invited back for a full proposal. Also, as John referenced, the governor did propose in his budget in January some bond funds from Prop 12, Prop 40, Prop 50, Prop 84 that had not yet been expended for urban forestry from CAL FIRE. So we are hopeful that those go forward. Of course, there's no guarantee, but the fact that they are bond funds and not general fund is a good thing. And we've even heard rumors that the proposed allocation that he put forward, which is only about $4 million, that they might be able to even scrape up a little bit more from that. So it was really good to hear that John does plan to go forward with a competitive grant program next year if those dollars are allocated. And at this point, we don't have any reason to believe they won't, because they are bond funds. And also, just to affirm what John said, the state has dramatically revised how it allocates bond funds. It used to basically allocate funds with a speculation of getting the funds back, and that has changed dramatically. So the dollars actually are in the bank. So if those funds are allocated, those should be safe as well. We don't know what CAL FIRE's budget will look like after that. Certainly, I'm sure a lot of folks have heard the news that, and I think John said this morning, there's fairly dire projections of what our budget's going to look like for this year and possibly next year. In terms of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which we've all come to rely on to support urban forestry, it has, I believe, 5 of the last 6 years, in addition to a one-time allocation from Prop 68. A couple years ago, AB 398 was enacted by the legislature and signed by the governor, which, among other things, essentially turned the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund into a tax, which means it can be used for anything. And if the legislature and the governor and the Department of Finance deem our situation so dire that they need to sweep those funds into the general fund, they will be able to do that. There's no constitutional provision against that, and it'll be very difficult to access those funds. As it is, it's been challenging for the last couple of years with the governor not proposing urban forestry from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for 3 consecutive years. That's really just been advocates in the legislature putting it back in. So we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen with the CAL FIRE budget, and we will just have to see what happens in the immediate future with regards to the budget that's released tomorrow by the administration, the May revise. I will say that the Assembly is not necessarily on the same page with everyone else right now, the Senate and the governor, with regards to how they want to approach the budget. I think initially everyone was thinking they would do this workload budget that John said, which is a little bit like the resolution that we see at the federal level each year. But the Assembly is feeling like the situation is so dire that they want to start doing deep cuts immediately. So there really is a lot of uncertainty, and that's probably going to be the key phrase that you take away from this conversation. With that, I'm going to transition into where California Relief is on grants right now. We have expended all of the funds that are available to us for our grant programs. We have 2 grants that are finishing up right now with state funds. and we have allocated all of those dollars. We were invited back to apply for a full proposal from CAL FIRE, and as Cindy mentioned, with Sarah's help in particular, and I really want to thank her for this, we retooled that proposal significantly to really speak to what we think some pressing needs are going to be for nonprofits right now. So we're looking at potentially higher grant amounts, higher amounts for personnel, slightly higher amounts for overhead, but really wanting to stress that if we get those funds, we will roll that out over 2 cycles with an emphasis on trying to support the network members and the NGOs that apply for those funds as best as possible, while of course still meeting the needs of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and CAL FIRE's program. I know a pressing question that's been around for actually several months now is what's going on with the bond. And as folks know, last year there was the idea of a natural resources bond that kind of morphed into a climate resiliency bond when it was introduced this year. And then March came around and everything's been put on hold. I wish I could offer something definitive on this, but I really can't. What I can tell you is that the Assembly, as we speak, is in Natural Resources Committee right now. The Assembly version of a bond is going to pass out of Natural Resources Committee today. It is going to go to Assembly Appropriations. The language is going to change dramatically. Right now, the language in there does not include any funding for urban forestry through CAL FIRE. We are obviously working to try to ensure that CAL FIRE does get into the mix. To be completely honest, we've been pretty cautious about a bond. And while we have been working to integrate urban forestry, we really waited till we felt like there was an opportunity to do something more meaningful with the bond before really coming out publicly on where we stood on that. And we did finally do that last week with a letter that we teamed with the Greenlining Institute and APEN and Scope LA to really speak to the need to create an economic stimulus bond that included urban forestry, but a lot of multi-sector investments that could drive climate resiliency, economic stimulus, and social equity. We're really happy with the way that letter turned out. It's received a lot of positive feedback. I'm happy to share it with folks if you want, and of course you're welcome to sign on to it. That did go to the governor's task force. It also went to the Assembly Natural Resources Committee, and we've spoken with that committee about that, and they were pleased with some of the recommendations that came out of that as well. But that's really the status of a bond. This is the first hearing that it's getting. I think much to everyone's surprise, the Senate came out with a proposal yesterday on their vision for economic stimulus, and it does not include a bond. It includes a $25 billion economic recovery fund, which if I had a better grasp of, I would share the details with, but I don't think anyone entirely is certain what that means, other than it's fairly ambitious. And the governor's going to release his May revised tomorrow. Moving on, I wanted to touch on a couple of other funding sources that I want to make folks aware of. Like I said, we're uncertain what the future holds, but we do know that right now, the Natural Resources Agency is sitting on $30 million for its Urban Greening Grant program. This is the program that's funded through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There is some uncertainty as to how protected those funds are, given that there are going to be some cuts being made by finance and the legislature in the coming months. But our understanding is that they're going to work to get an RFP out for that sooner rather than later in hopes to be able to protect those funds. We don't know when they'll see Urban Greening Grant funds again. So I would encourage everyone to really look closely at that program. $30 million, obviously not a small amount. They have funded a lot of nonprofit California Relief Network groups with those dollars. And certainly if you have questions, you can contact myself. You can contact Cindy. She's actually had to do an Urban Greening Grant application before, and we can try to provide as much guidance as possible. One of the other funds that we think will still be around because it's funded through the state highway account is the Environmental Enhancement and Mitigation Program. As most of you are aware, that was trimmed a few years ago to only fund urban forestry and land conservation. So it is a good resource for urban forestry, a little less than $7 million each year. And that's another thing to really take a look at because there is so much uncertainty in what the future holds in terms of funding for natural resources and urban forestry in particular. I think the last thing I'm going to close with is just a couple of other things that we are doing to try to help nonprofits and the California Relief Network during this time. A couple people mentioned extensions for existing contracts with CAL FIRE. We have written explicit budget bill language to extend three of the contracts that John has right now for urban forestry. That's an effort that's going directly between California Relief and the state legislature. However, a larger collective that I think John alluded to, that includes ourselves and Nature Conservancy in Audubon, California, they're working with the Natural Resources Agency to hope that just a blanket extension can be provided to all grants under the Resources Agency, which would include CAL FIRE. And if that went through, obviously that would help, probably a 1-year extension. In that same effort, they're also urging Natural Resources Agency and the departments under them to recognize that nonprofits are really struggling right now. So I'll give one example. The Urban Greening Program, which as many of you know, has not typically allowed for overhead, much to our dismay. They're actually relaxing that a little bit right now and allowing for some funds to be used for overhead. So that's a step in the positive direction. And we're also hoping that there'll be opportunities to be more flexible with the allocation of the funds, existing funds, to the grantees as we struggle through these times. So that's what we have in a nutshell in terms of what's going on at the state level regarding policy. I'm sure folks are aware that there's efforts to do more at the federal level with stimulus funds as well. And we continue to be engaged with SUFC and American Forests on that. But I think I'll stop there. And if there's any questions, I think Sarah's going to help me out here in terms of trying to field them, or at least read them.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. We just had one so far. Wondering, at the very beginning, you mentioned some allocations of the bond fund. Could you repeat what those were?
Sure, yeah. In January, the governor proposed allocating about $4 million that was scraped together from previous bond funds over the last, I guess it'd be almost 20 years now, Prop 12, Prop 40, and Prop 84. CAL FIRE was in all of those bonds, and just some funds that cumulatively were just kind of left unspent are still available to CAL FIRE. That totals about $4 million. And as I said, we've heard rumors that it could go up even another million or two from that. So a competitive grant program next year does look likely. It'll be a small fund. It'll be a small source though. But one thing that's probably important to know is that because it is bond funds and not the greenhouse gas reduction fund, there's probably going to be more flexibility in how those dollars can be used within the realm of urban forestry.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Chuck about funding or anything happening with the state? I think when we send out resources from today, we can send links to a lot of the different programs you talked about, so people can look at those.
Great. Well,
here Ken has one.
Yeah.
With decreased volunteers, we've had to spend more staff and contract time to help maintain trees. Is there a possibility for more allocation to maintenance?
That's a really good question, Ken. I would like to think that in John's next program or CAL FIRE's next program with that small amount of bond dollars, it would be open to that. The way the language was written in Prop 40 and Prop 84 was funds just directly to CAL FIRE for the purposes of the Urban Forestry Act. The Prop 12 language was written explicit to tree planting, but I think that would be a very, very small portion of that $4 to $6 billion bucket if it did get allocated. So, you know, that's certainly a case to make directly to CAL FIRE. I mean, I think there is going to be flexibility in that grant program.
Thank you. And then any input on Prop 1 funds for greening projects?
Prop 1, well, there's a Prop 1 at LA. So if Eugene's around, she might be able to speak to that. Prop 1 statewide for greening projects. I honestly could not provide much input on that right now. It's not something we've really explored.
Okay. And what about anything specifically related to oaks?
Well, I mean, there's the Wildlife Conservation Board has the Oak Woodland Preservation Program. I don't think that's been funded in quite some time. I'm trying to think of the allocations that came from Prop 68. And I don't recall anything explicitly for that. That does not mean that WCB couldn't have taken some of its general allocation from Prop 68 and funneled it into that program. So that would be something that you'd want to look at, probably more with WCB or the Forest Health Program with CAL FIRE, which is a bit more focused on wildfire prevention, but it's also a myriad of projects that can be accomplished through that. So that'd be a question to go directly to John or Angie at CAL FIRE.
Thank you. And one more. Have you ever seen funds available for releasing mature urban trees from suffocating tree wells with concrete and brick?
I have not seen that. That's probably the first question I've got on that. I don't recall seeing that. That's not to say that the flexibility and bond funds wouldn't be there for those purposes, but no, I can't say that I've explicitly seen dollars allocated for those purposes.
Oh, I missed a question. Will the state have control of potential stimulus funds from the federal government?
Possibly. Yeah, I mean, so what the legislature is doing right now is evaluating how they're going to close this gap. And certainly federal stimulus funds are going to be factored into that. And while there's no guarantee, the idea is to be able to kind of silo out what the state's going to want to cover in terms of priority programs and within various sectors, and then what they hope the federal government will cover. So those are conversations that are going on with our legislature. They funnel up to the governor, and then the governor will be making the request to the federal, to Congress and the president to see some of those funds come down. And yeah, traditionally, those federal dollars will have the state will have some control over how those federal dollars are allocated. So I know we're running a couple minutes behind. Are there any other questions, Sarah?
One last one. Well, someone asked if we'd send a slide, and yeah, we can do that. We'll send a summary. And then, do you know anything about if there's greening, particularly for deserts or dry landscapes?
That's a better question for Defenders of Wildlife. If someone wants to send me an email, I can give you their contact information. They've been the point on trying to get funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for deserts. They haven't met with a lot of success there, but they're definitely the point people to talk to on deserts funding in California. I'm going to make one real quick plug. Sarah's worked with me on this before. We are a technical advisor through a subcontract at Enterprise to the Strategic Growth Council's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. This year, as part of our contract, we're going to be partnering with Climate Resolve to do a webinar on June 24th related to how climate resiliency and urban greening interact in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. I will send an invite out to everyone that's interested. I'll probably go out through the network. And I encourage you to come to this because this is another opportunity for groups to pair themselves with maybe non-traditional partners, in this case, housing developers, to hopefully secure more funding for urban greening. So the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program does require 2 urban greening elements, and trees obviously fit well into that equation. So if you need more information, feel free to contact me, but I just wanted to put that on everyone's radar.
Thanks so much, Chuck. And if any other questions come through, we'll try and answer them offline.